Hey, it's Jeff Sanders. The episode this week is a bit unique. In fact, I've been waiting quite a while to share this story. My wife Tessa and I had a baby a few months ago, and we had quite a journey to get there. In this very unique episode of the 5 a.m. Miracle podcast, I chat with my wife Tessa about our fertility journey. So this is the 5 a.m. Miracle episode number 255, Fertility, IVF, and Making Babies with Tessa Sanders.
And I think there's this idea that I don't want to tell people because if something bad were to happen, then I would have to tell them that as well. In a way, that's misguided because when something really bad happens, you do lean on your really close friends and family members to help you through those times.
Good morning and welcome to the 255th episode of the 5 a.m. Miracle. I am Jeff Sanders and this is the podcast dedicated to dominating your day before breakfast. My goal is to help you bounce out of bed with enthusiasm, create powerful, lifelong habits, and tackle your grandest goals with extraordinary energy. Here on the show, we discuss early mornings, and we dive into topics like healthy habits, personal development, rockin' productivity, and sometimes we go off script. The episode this week is one of those. And in fact, it's the first of a two-part series. The second part will air soon. And before we get into the discussion this week, a quick disclaimer that the episode this week features an adult conversation about fertility and making babies and things that are related to that. It's a clean conversation, but not necessarily one that's ideal for younger listeners. Also, Tessa wanted me to mention that in this conversation, we discuss our fertility journey from our very narrow perspective. You know, everyone has their own experience, and we have no intention of making our story sound special or unique or really in any way deserving of more attention than someone else's. We just knew for the last few years that this was a story that had the potential to help others who are facing similar challenges, and we especially want you to know that you are not alone. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Hey, welcome to the 5 a.m. Miracle Studio. I am super excited today to be talking once again with my wife, Tessa.
Hi.
How you doing today?
I'm doing good.
I'm excited to have you back on the show today, mostly because this is not only like your 8th time on the show, I think, but mostly because of today's topic. We have a new visitor in the studio with us today. You want to introduce her?
Yes, next to me, sleeping in a pile of blankets and pink things is our little baby Maisie.
That's right. We've got a daughter, which is super exciting. This is the first time that we've had a baby in our lives, and today's episode is going to be all about how she came to be, which is going to be a lot of fun. Before we get to the conversation today, I do want to put in a little disclaimer, and that's to say this episode is going to be more, not necessarily graphic, but it is going to be more of an adult conversation. So if you have kids with you and you're not a fan of them hearing a lot of the details around fertility and pregnancy and bringing babies into the world, this may be a time to pause the episode and come back at a later date. But until then, this episode will stay clean. It will just be nice and detailed on the things that tell our story, because that's one thing I wanted to do today was to really share what we've gone through in the last basically 3 years. Because that's where this story began, and that's where today is going to start. So let's go with that. 3 years ago, Tessa, where were you? What were you doing? Where did this whole thing begin?
So I was in grad school getting my degree in educational leadership.
Your doctorate.
Yep. And was very sort of focused on career and school and all sorts of things like that. And I sort of had it in the back of my head that we would have a family at some point, that we would have a baby, but we would just wait until I was done with school and graduated. And, maybe that's a little bit later than some people had, planned to start a family, but we were sort of, in a way, putting it off until that stuff was finished.
Which makes sense. I mean, you've been in school or were in school for many years.
I like school.
Lots of degrees and lots of education, which is wonderful. But obviously, it's more challenging to pursue a career with that kind of intensity and also raise a child, which we have learned in the last few months. Wow, there's a lot going on there. So in part, it was a great thing that we waited. but our story kind of unfolds a little bit differently in the sense that it took longer than we wanted, and that's where this whole thing really kicks off. So 3 years ago, you were in school. You were a few months from graduation, and you decided that it was time to stop taking birth control to lean towards the idea of getting pregnant.
Yeah, I had heard from some people basically that you don't get pregnant the second you stop taking birth control. So stop earlier because it could take a little bit of time. And so I was thinking, if we want to have a baby shortly after I graduate, I would stop taking my birth control a few months before that. And then on the off chance I got pregnant before school was over, I still wouldn't have the baby until much later, and so it would all be fine. So a few months before I graduated, I decided to stop taking the birth control and sort of see how that would go. And at the time, I realized really how long I have been on birth control since high school, basically. And so I was really surprised to find how my body reacted to just not being on birth control. It really took me a few months to detox from that. And I had really bad headaches and was really dizzy. It seemed like for weeks on end, all because I was just sort of detoxing from being on hormone regulating medication, I guess, for such a long time. And honestly, it made me really want at that point to not be on medication ever again, just because I could see how it was affecting my body and how much better I felt when I really had fully detoxed from it.
So at that point, you were off of the birth control, and your body at some point began to feel a little more normal. And so that's when we basically began to try to get pregnant the old-fashioned way.
Yep. Without doing really anything, without thinking too hard about it, just sort of, we spent a few months just, living a good life and and hoping things would just sort of happen really naturally.
Right. And you could fast forward this clock about 18 months, because that's essentially how long that we gave it the old college try and didn't have any results to speak of. Yeah. So during that time period, that was, I would say, the beginning of the frustration that kicked in for us, down the road, in the sense that we were, at this point, we're 31 years old, both of us. And, the clock begins to tick as, you get a little older, and we're thinking we'd like to get pregnant sometime soon without kind of the age factor being an issue. So it was 18 months after trying that we decided we should go talk to somebody about this.
Well, and before we were really talking to anybody, we were sort of tracking ovulation and timing things so that we could hopefully get a better result. And after that didn't work for months, probably 6 months. That's when we went in and talked to the OB about fertility stuff.
And that's where we ended up going to the clinic here in Nashville, the Nashville Fertility Center, which basically in Nashville is kind of the only place you can go. There's like one location, you go there and you get, I'm not going to say anything bad about the center because it's a good place, but it's intimidating to walk into a place like that and talk to somebody, and to, at that point for us, start to be pretty vulnerable with sharing, we've been trying a lot of this stuff, it's not working, is there something wrong with us? What do we do now? I think that's for me when kind of a lot of the fear began to kick in. And
I remember being really sort of thrown off by all the medical jargon that they used. And I still don't understand a lot of it. But even just knowing, learning about what IVF even is, I think I had a sense of you make babies in test tubes, but that's really all. And that's when at that time, we really started to understand what all is involved with IVF and what that actually means and how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost and all the stuff tied into it beyond just sort of what I had, the very little that I knew about what it was.
I remember going through the process myself thinking, at each stage along the way, well, this is the one that's going to work. So we're not going to need to know the rest of this information. So I almost, in many cases, felt don't tell me all of that because I'm not going to need to know that because we're not going to be doing that.
Right.
And then it turned out that we were all about that.
Yeah. So before we actually did IVF, which is in vitro fertilization, we did what they call IUI, which is intrauterine insemination. So we tried some sort of different reproductive assistance, as they call it, before we actually got to the point where we decided we really do need to do IVF.
And at that point, they had run some tests to determine exactly what was going on. And their basic conclusion, at least for the first few months, was we don't know what's going on.
Yeah. So when you are trying to figure out why you're not having a baby, they sort of go through a few different sort of check boxes and say, is it that your hormones are off and that's why you're not getting pregnant? Is it that your like physical anatomy is off and that's why you're not getting pregnant? Is it that you're getting pregnant but you're not staying pregnant? And so they sort of did all these tests. Is it that the sperms aren't swimming, or there are not enough of them, or the eggs aren't coming out, or they're not right? All these different things. And they did test after test after test and weren't able to find really any reason why we wouldn't be getting pregnant.
Until eventually they did.
Right. So while we're going through all these tests and doing some of the intrauterine insemination, the IUI, they eventually came back and someone discovered that I had what they called anti-sperm antibodies. So the way they described it to me was that my egg has like a little force field or something around it that's actually keeping the sperm out. So at that point, we realized there's no reason to continue with the insemination, which is basically where you kind of put some sperm in there at the right time and hope that the sperm and the egg get together. Because for me, that was not going to happen. The sperm is not going to go into the egg on its own. So we decided that we needed to pursue IVF at that point. And specifically, we decided to do the kind of IVF where they actually take the sperm and the egg, someone like a scientist or I don't know what they are, and actually like put the sperm into the egg directly to sort of bypass that anti-sperm antibody layer or whatever is happening.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you and I are not doctors in that sense. You are a doctor, but not that kind of doctor. And so walking through this whole process, both of us had this kind of, I don't know, glossy-eyed feeling most of the time because there was a lot of language we didn't know. There was a lot of procedures that we were unfamiliar with. Having, years later looking back at this, we went through so many different appointments that I felt like I really understood a lot of it. But those first few months was pretty daunting. Just learning, the learning curve was pretty intense.
And it really feels like something is happening to you.
Oh, yeah.
It's, we can talk later about our pregnancy journey and labor and delivery and all that, where I think things changed a bit, but especially in this early phase, the IVF part of this journey, it really just felt like something happening to me, just sort of a series of medical checklists that I was going through.
And as this whole process started, even before we even did our first test, I remember we had to sit down and sign a bunch of paperwork with all these different scenarios of, if X happens, then Y, and what will you do when? Mostly saying that if you end up with fertilized eggs, who gets them in a divorce? Who gets them if someone dies? What happens if the eggs, are unusable? What happens if they're viable and they're just extras? Like all these scenarios of what to do when. And we essentially were playing God. It's kind of how it's pitched to you, is that this is it's a spiritual, ethical, moral, kind of soul-searching kind of process in a way, because there's a lot going on here that isn't what the average person goes through. And so you had, both of us had to really think through, like, what do we do with this whole process? And I think that a large part of me was totally fine with the whole thing, but there is that sense when you're going through it that, like, I'm messing with something here that I think still, even to this day, I feel kind of weird about, because it's almost like we created something out of thin air, but yet I know how the process works. It's still kind of strange.
Yeah. And I think there's a time early on where I was sort of asking myself, like, should we do this? Is it God's plan that we don't have kids? Or is it that if I just wait longer, then God's timing will work out without doing IVF? And I think, like, through praying and taking some time to really think about it, I got this sense that, like, this is God's plan. This is God's timing, is for us to do IVF. And so that, for me, it didn't really feel like we were playing God or trying to take control of something outside of God's hands, but that this is how our path was meant to be through God's plan.
And I think that throughout the whole process, it felt more right to me as we were doing it. I think in part because, as like a productivity guy, as a guy who's pretty methodical through the way I approach things, I got to a sense where I understood enough of what was going on that I had a sense of, okay, here's our next action, here's the next step to take, and we're going to go do this. And then if this process doesn't work, we have the backup plan in place. And I think that part of me felt a little better about it, because then I felt like we had some sort of sense of, we're going to start this round of medications, or we're going to do these shots, or we're going to go through this appointment. And then it became, it was daunting and overwhelming and very expensive, but beyond that, we had a little more control over what was going on, which I felt better about, as opposed to feeling like this is totally out of my hands and whatever happens, happens.
Yeah. And I think, we were very productive people, but it was like there was so much going on between medication and paperwork with receipts and financial stuff that if you are not a very productive person, I think it would be very difficult. But
this is a good time to mention your binder, because as this process began, we began to notice the amount of paperwork involved and just all of the stuff we had to organize on our own just to wrap our own brains around what was happening. And so you created a binder to organize that.
Yeah. So I had, generally around our house, we use digital copies. So we don't keep a lot of paper. We don't have file folders full of paperwork. We really try to scan things or take pictures and then get rid of the paper copy. But for some reason with IVF, I really had a lot more paper in my life. So I created a binder that had all the information we got about IVF and fertility, all the receipts. I had dates on everything. I wrote on there sort of in my wording, like, what was this receipt for? And at the time, I don't really know why I was doing it, but I think part of it was that I really wanted to have control over something. And then later on, I was able to sort of flip back through some of that stuff. And it was kind of like a journal, even though it was just like a bunch of receipts and paperwork, but sort of documenting, like, here are all the different steps that we went through. Here are all the different doctor visits we had. And I think in a way, it was nice for me to see, like, as the binder got thicker and thicker and thicker, like, to sort of acknowledge how hard it was and how much work we really had put into it. Because we did a lot of it without talking to a bunch of people about it. So, it's in a way that binder serves as like documentation of all the things that we did to get where we are.
Yeah, that's a good point to mention too, the idea of isolation. And, that we would go into the waiting room of the clinic, and there was a lot of sad people that were in that waiting room, people that were on their own or people that were going through, you get bad news a lot there. You walk in thinking like today's the day we get some positive direction. And often that wasn't the case. We had a lot of obstacles and setbacks, and it was a very isolating process to go through because we weren't sharing this stuff publicly. We weren't talking about this with most of our friends didn't even know until much later on. I think that can pose a large challenge. And in part, that's why we're doing this talk today, because after going through all of this, it really seems like something that needs to be a lot more open. Actually, I have a podcasting friend here in Nashville who's launching an entire podcast about fertility, which I think is a very, very great topic to bring out in the open, because the last thing that I would want to do going forward would be to go through something like this alone, because it's not worth it in that sense.
Well, and I think there's this idea that I don't want to tell people because if something bad were to happen, then I would have to tell them that as well. But I think in a way that's misguided, because when something really bad happens, you do lean on your really close friends and family members to help you through those times. And so if there are people who are doing IVF, I would encourage them to find a few people to talk to about, people who you would want to be there, or who would be there for you if something didn't turn out as planned, and to have more than one person that you can sort of talk to and lean on. The IVF process is really long, and there are lots of emotional and physical ups and downs, and I think it's helpful for the close people in your life to know what's going on.
Certainly is. And it's interesting too that since we finished this process, I know of other people in my life now who have gone through this, who didn't tell anybody either, and now they're on the other side of it talking about it. And it's interesting that there are a lot more people out there that are going through things that you think you're by yourself in that journey, but that's never true. There's always somebody else going through it. And in our case, like, I know of many friends and family who have been through challenges on their own like this. And so it's just interesting that I think our natural inclination is to just do it alone. And that's kind of the way I approach most things in my life, is I'll figure it out, and I don't need somebody else. But I think anything of this magnitude, it's the better approach is definitely to do it with other people.
And not a ton of people. Like, I think there's a
True.
line.
Yeah.
But I just think, you don't have to sort of suffer alone. And with the IVF process, you're talking about people in the waiting room being sad-faced.
Yeah.
But, even when we did have good news, I was so aware that other people were really struggling that I didn't really want to share it, or I was really cautious about who I shared it with because I didn't want them to feel sad or upset that they weren't getting good news like we were getting. And so, it wasn't just that I needed support when we had rough times. It was that I wanted to celebrate with people when we had positive news. So I was thankful to have that support system along the way.
This is kind of along the same lines. I remember we were going in for an appointment and the lady at the front desk was pregnant. And I was thinking, I had jealous thoughts about that. I felt like, not like I was antagonistic towards her or something, but there is that sense of you have something that I don't, which I think was a very strange thing. I'm normally not that kind of person, but when you're actively trying to get something for such a long time, I think those feelings are pretty common.
Yeah. And there were some times too where I felt like sort of pregnancy was this world that I was not allowed to be a part of. And so the idea of reading books about pregnancy or about breastfeeding or about buying maternity clothes, I sort of felt like I shouldn't be. Like I was not sort of deserving of doing those kinds of things. And so during the IVF process, I would listen on the way back and forth to the clinic. I would listen to podcasts about pregnancy, but I felt really like I don't want anybody to know that I'm doing this because I just didn't feel sort of entitled to do that. So I think that's just like one of the many layers of emotional stuff that comes with IVF. I know throughout the process, physically, I became like bloated from all the medications that I was on. And I really probably would have benefited from having some maternity clothes that sort of expand at the waist. But I just couldn't bring myself to go to the maternity section at a store during that time. And I didn't ask anybody, my family members to help me out there. But I think if I were to do it again, which we don't have to do that part again, but I would get some maternity clothes a little earlier so that I could be like physically comfortable. But I know at the time, emotionally, I just like wasn't able to let myself be in that space.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of process because there's things that are happening that we know are happening, but then there's like the mind games of, down the road, if this actually works, which I try not to play that game too often, but if this works, a few months from now we'll be in this place and then I'll need to, shop at the child section of Target or whatever the case is. Like I wouldn't even, the same way, I wouldn't even go to those sections because I'm like, I'm not going to buy, little baby socks and shoes right now because that just seems silly to even let myself have that. While it's still so up in the air. Because that was a huge part of the process is that you're given a lot of numbers. The odds of this thing happening is this. And because of that, this may not work. And that was always the message was this is probably going to fail. And then if it did work, it was like, okay, you got lucky. And that's just kind of how it always felt to me was we just kept getting lucky. And then sometimes we wouldn't. And so then the reality would sink in again. And so I was always, is that back and forth mind game of like, how am I okay with this while it's happening, knowing that I'm getting a series of bad news, scenarios frequently.
And the money keeps racking up too. So
yes, constantly.
There's the forward thinking of like, what if we do have a family and what will it be like if we are parents? But then there's also that sort of cha-ching adding up in the background where if this doesn't work, not only have we put a lot of time and effort and tears into this, but a lot of money too.
Well, the money thing is really, really interesting and horrific in so many ways because we live in a state in the U.S. where IVF is not covered by insurance. There may be some insurance plans that cover a small piece of it, but we live in a place where if you want to do a fertility process like this, it is a total out-of-pocket expense. And so that meant we literally had to raise the money, get the cash together, pay for it, and it was tens of thousands of dollars. And we had to go through two different rounds, we'll get to in a second, but two different rounds of the IVF process to get the number of eggs we needed. And so the price almost doubled in the middle of us doing this. And there's such that sense of like financial stress. There's the fear of like, if this works, I'll be a parent someday. And then there's that fear. There's a fear the whole thing will fail. There's a fear we'll have to do this process a million times in a row. And we're going to go bankrupt while trying to do it. And so it's all of that mixed together while still hoping it's all going to work.
Well, and being thankful that, we have family members who can help pitch in and that we have jobs that make money. And, there were times where I would look around that sort of dreary waiting area at the fertility clinic and just realize how many people don't even have the means or the support to get there.
Right. I mean, it's a daunting thing, and it really feels exclusive in that you have to have the means to be able to go through it. And it's also bizarre because 30 years ago, it didn't even exist. And now it does, and it's still very experimental. I mean, those multiple times they asked us to be part of studies, and they're trying to figure out how to improve the process. And so I felt like, in a lot of ways, we were trying some random weird experiment, and we really had no idea what was going to happen. And I think that whole process to me, that's not how I approach most of the things I do in my life. So to go through that, I felt like this is going to be a really interesting story when it's all finished.
Well, it's cool to think that, in the past, people who had infertility had no options like this.
I mean, adoption would have been the option, right?
Yeah.
There wasn't much else to choose from. And now there are lots of avenues you can choose from, thankfully. And so that's, to that degree, I mean, it's a great, science to have in the world. I'm glad it's there. But man, it's such a trip in so many ways.
Yeah, it's just it's a mix of like really, really cool and like really kind of awful, both at the same time.
And there's the reality that neither one of us are big fans of being at hospitals in general. Our very first appointment, we went back for, an ultrasound, I believe. And we went back to the small room, and the lights were dimmed, and I had basically a panic attack. I was just really not comfortable being there. I don't like hospitals and doctors in general. I want to try to stay away from that, which is in part why I like to run and eat healthy, avoid all of that. And so I think there was a big adjustment just on my end, just to be okay with being there and having blood tests all the time and being poked all the time. And then I had to stab you with needles all the time to get all these hormones in there. And it was, I think, on many levels, a big adjustment.
Yeah. And most of it wasn't happening to you anyway.
Right.
And it was still, he's talking about getting blood drawn, but it was mostly me.
Well, it's like sympathy pains. And then I had that going on at the same time. So it's, yes, the majority of it was definitely on you, and you were a huge, trooper in that sense. But it was definitely a journey for the two of us to go through. And in part, because this really is like a joint venture. There was a lot involved on both of our sides in that sense. So let's pick the story up with where we left off. We had done the IUI. We had started IVF. We had the test run that said that the anti-sperm antibodies was our cause. And so the IVF process basically was a ton of medications, lots of hormone injections, a lot of that process to essentially build up your body to create a bunch of eggs all at the same time.
And so normally your eggs are released once a month.
Right.
And so one of the medications was to sort of keep them in, and another medication was to grow more than normal.
Right.
This is how I understand it. This might not be exactly right, but this is how I understand it.
Yeah.
And so the first sort of the first phase of IVF is to just build up all these eggs in my body that they can then remove a whole bunch sort of at the same time. And so during that time, we were doing shots every day to sort of build up these eggs in kind of like an abnormal way.
At that time, that was the estrogen and progesterone, right? Or get this backwards.
No.
That was later.
We weren't there yet.
Well, there's a lot of, this one's confusing. There were a lot of hormones that we were injecting into you so that your body could build up the eggs, which all was leading up to an extraction, basically, where a doctor comes in and does, it's essentially a minor surgery, and they pull out as many eggs as you've produced. And then at that point, this is where the numbers game like kicks in. They're looking for how many of these eggs are viable, like healthy as they are. And then from there, that's when they do the injection to try to fertilize as many of them as are healthy as possible. And then there's a question of, well, how many of them successfully fertilized? And then at that point, there's a waiting period to see if they actually grew. And then I think that was a 5-day period. And then after those 5 days of growth, how many of them are successfully healthy after 5 days of growth? And then of those, you freeze them. And then at a later date, you go through and actually implant them to try to get pregnant. And in the middle of all this, there's also the genetic testing we paid for to try to weed out any, of the eggs that may have chromosomal abnormalities or other issues that may kick in. So it was really a numbers game at that point to figure out how many eggs can we extract from you that will ultimately be a super healthy, frozen, genetically, healthy embryo that can successfully be implanted for you to be pregnant.
And this is sort of the way that our nurses were recommending that we go through this process, and our doctors. So
yes.
Some people don't do the genetic testing.
And some don't do frozen.
Right. And some don't do what's called ICSI, and I can't remember what it stands for, where they actually take the sperm and put it in the egg.
Right. So there's a variety of ways to approach this, and we chose essentially the one that cost the very most, that was the most invasive, that was the most complicated, but also the one that in the end theoretically would produce a very healthy baby that would have been, the best possible outcome that we were looking for. So as we did this, it was round one, which we didn't know at the time, was we had, I believe it was 16 eggs that were extracted, and of those, only one ultimately was a healthy, frozen, genetically normal embryo. And the day we got that news was not really a fun day. I mean, that's one of those where a phone call is coming to tell you the results, and then we got it, and it was, in many ways, a huge letdown because the numbers that you're given tell you that you have to have a larger number than one because there's a pretty strong chance that the eggs may not make it all the way through the process. There's a thawing process after they're frozen. There's an implantation. There's a possibility of miscarriage. There's a possibility of stillbirths and other genetic issues. And so you ideally have a variety of eggs to choose from, and we only had one. And so that's why we had to then wait a few months and then try the whole process over again.
So we had the option of implanting that one, and the IVF process that they've done, or that we did, we really did take a lot of steps to decrease the likelihood of a miscarriage. So there's a chance that we could have implanted that one egg and everything would have been fine.
Yes.
There were tests, and I found out I was physically, anatomically able to have a baby. They would regulate my hormones with medication. We would choose an egg that was genetically normal. So a lot of the things that could lead to miscarriage, like having hormones that were off or physical anatomy that was off or an egg that wasn't viable, we had sort of mitigated a lot of those factors. So we could have taken that one egg, implanted it, and maybe it would have worked out.
Possibly, yep.
But we decided at the time that we wanted to try again, grow some more eggs, go through that whole first phase again to try to get a few more eggs, partly so that we could have a backup in case the one that we chose didn't work, didn't stay. And then also we thought if we did want to have more than one child, even if that one egg did work, we would have to go through the whole process again later in life. And with pregnancy, that biological clock is always ticking in the background. And so we decided we would go ahead and do another round of what they call egg retrieval, growing the eggs and retrieving the eggs. Then, instead of waiting, implanting the egg, seeing if we had a kid, and then going through the whole process again later when we're, 35, 38, however old. So essentially, we went through the whole process again and now have frozen babies from a 32-year-old woman instead of a 38-year-old woman, or whenever we would maybe try to expand our family again.
So at that point, we decided to do round two, which, as I mentioned before, meant there's a huge increase in the amount of time being spent again. There's more money being spent. There's much more emotional stress at that point because we went through a first round and it didn't go well. I mean, in reality, getting one is still successful. That's still a great thing. But in terms of the odds of everything working, we had this extra sense of pressure because we really wanted round two to be effective, because there are plenty of couples who go through IVF like this round after round after round until they get to a point where they either give up, go broke, or just try another avenue. And that was also in the back of my mind that I was really hoping that was not going to be our story. As it turns out, it wasn't. We got round two. Once again, it was 16 eggs extracted, but of those, 6 ended up being healthy, genetically normal, frozen, well-off embryos, which left us with 3 boys and 4 girls in that group, because they tell you the gender. I mean, they ask you if you want to know. Of course, we wanted to know. So we have 3 boys and 4 girls in that group, so 7 possible babies, which is a kind of daunting all by itself. But that was the news we wanted, and that was a really good day. Along this process, that was definitely a good day. So we had the choice at that point we asked them, like, how do you pick one of these, embryos? And they rate them. They give them a grade, basically, figuring out kind of how their chromosomes are aligned, like which one is the healthiest. And they picked one for us, and that one turned out to be the little girl in our studio today. But at the time, that was up to them. They picked it for us, and we chose this embryo to then implant a couple of months later, based on timing of cycles and everything, and we got the implantation done a few months later.
So we took a break after that second round of egg retrieval, partly because my body was just really reacting against all the medication and all the sort of messing around that we had been doing. So I took a few months off to let my body just detox. I sort of weaned off all the medication and just went back to totally natural, sort of let my body totally detox from all the medications that I was on. And we also took that time to come up with a little bit of a new financial plan, because we had already spent more than we had originally anticipated. And again, I'm very thankful for our family members who were helpful during that time. But we took a few months off, and then in the fall started to gear up for what they call the implantation, which is a whole nother set of drugs. So at this time, I'm off the medications related to like growing eggs, and I'm starting medications related to making my body like a happy, warm place for this egg to live.
Did you want to mention the hyperstimulation thing as well that happened?
Yeah, that's essentially, so at the end of the second round of egg retrieval, my body kind of shut down and was like, this is not this is not a normal thing to do.
Right.
And so your ovaries had been sort of asked by these medications to produce a whole lot of eggs, and so the medication is stimulating your ovaries to like make more eggs and keep them in. And it's a very unnatural process, which again is amazing that science can make your body do these things that it's sort of not meant to do. But after the end of the second round, my body was just like, this is not happening. So I went into what they call ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which, it didn't last for a really long time, but in the moment you're just like, how can I carry on? My body like really feels like it's shutting down. But fortunately, my body, after being off all the medications and just taking some time, my body was able to sort of reset and go back to normal. And so we were able to sort of carry on with the next phase.
And the next phase involved the daily shots that ultimately lasted for about 12 weeks, which probably, I think, from my perspective, that was the part you didn't enjoy the most.
Yes.
Because that was a daily round of shots that are painful, and it's a pretty large needle, and it's not a fun process, but that was the progesterone that we had to, balance that out, that with the estrogen to make sure that was going to work. And that was also interesting too, because we were going through this process of injecting you with hormones, and we would go into the office to check those levels. And this was part of the process, I think, that was frustrating for me, was that we were given a lot of information that essentially is just very cautious people trying to, play the game in the right way that's going to not get our hopes up. But because of that approach, which is probably the correct approach, is the one of saying we're not going to give you information that's a false positive, they lean on kind of freaking out about things that aren't actually problems. And so we were given a lot of information that said, this could be a problem. This may lead down this bad path. You may end up with, a baby that has these problems, or you may not have a baby at all. And so we were constantly being told information that made us think worst case scenario. And that kept happening even as we were basically about to get pregnant, and even after we were actually pregnant. And so that part to me was one of the most frustrating aspects of this whole thing, was that I wanted to be given real information without just the tendency to lean towards the negative. That doesn't help someone who's already kind of going through emotional roller coaster rides anyway. So that was part of the process. It's not a fun part, but I think that is a tendency for those who've talked to a lot of doctors. I think that's pretty common.
And I think it's paired with this idea of expectations. So we had the expectations that we would stop the shots at a certain time. And then we found out, actually, your body's not producing these hormones like it should on its own. So you need to keep taking these shots. And that was, I think, upsetting because I was so focused on the end of these shots because they were so painful that I really wanted to be done with them. And so to then say, oh, you need to keep taking them sort of made us think, is there something wrong? Is something happening? Did things not go as planned? All to find out that this, having to stay on them for a little bit longer is not unusual. But I think the expectations that we had and the information that we're given just sort of put us into this place of frustration and fear that in the end sounds like we didn't actually need to be
experiencing it at all. Right. Yeah, exactly. So we began the rounds of estrogen and progesterone, all leading up to implantation, which happened, what was that, a few weeks in?
Yes. After we started this, so we started the shots like early October, and the implantation was like mid to late October.
Yes.
So everything was perfectly timed out by the clinic, and so yeah. And
then we went into essentially an operating room for the day of. And I got to look at the embryo in a microscope, and they asked me like, so is this yours? Let's verify this. And I was like, I have no idea. There's just some random dots in a little petri dish.
But it is kind of fun to know that we have millions and millions, it seems like, of pictures of her.
Yes.
And to know that like that very first picture we have of her is like her little fertilized egg, and Jeff was the first one to see it. I mean, other than medical professionals, but we have this picture, her like very first baby picture, which is just like an egg. I don't know. That's kind of cool.
It is. And then, so you got the implantation completed, which then technically means at that very moment you were pregnant, but we had to wait a few weeks to make sure that it stuck.
So from what I understand, and again, if there are like medical people out there, I'm probably messing this whole thing up.
Oh, if you're a doctor listening to this, just go ahead and email me and tell me how wrong we are. It's totally fine. But we're just making our best guess at this.
So from what I understand, they sort of take this egg that is now fertilized and sort of put it in the right place. But it takes a couple weeks for it to like really implant into the side of the uterus and for my body to start making like the hormones that it needs to sort of maintain a pregnancy.
Right.
So after a couple weeks, they said, if you come in at this time, we'll take this blood test and we'll be able to see how much of the pregnancy hormone you have. And that will tell us if it's worked or not. And of course they say like, don't take a home pregnancy test because they're not helpful. And we will tell you when you come in based on the blood test and the hormone levels, if you're pregnant or not. And so I'm at home like 10 days into this 2-week wait, taking all these pregnancy tests and trying to see if I can like faintly see like a pink line.
And I remember this whole process of me being like, Tessa, stop that. Don't do that. Don't do that.
And I was like, okay, I won't. And then I did anyway.
Yep.
And I remember one morning, because they say to, if you're getting pregnant in the normal way, you can take your pregnancy test early in the morning, right when you wake up. You have the most chance of like getting an accurate reading. So I remember one morning I woke up, peed on the stick, and I could swear I saw like the faintest little line. And so I woke Jeff up and was like, look at this stick. And of course he is like in the depths of sleep. So he looks at it and it's dark in the room and he doesn't see this faint line that I maybe made up and was like, it's fine. Like, you're doing it way too early anyway. Like, don't worry. And I was like, no. I think there's a line. And he was like, okay, crazy lady. So we didn't have this sort of, like you see on TV where like the wife knows that she's pregnant and like reveals it to the dad with like a coffee cup that just happens to say like world's best dad and like surprise. Like we never had that.
Nope.
And I think, there was a part of me that's really sad that we, didn't get to reveal to each other or to our parents in that way.
Right.
We didn't get that sort of normal thing of, guess what, Mom? Having a baby and everyone is crying and it's beautiful. Like we didn't have that.
But on the flip side, and people go through this kind of process, you do have choices that you otherwise would never have. Everything from gender to genetic testing to, making sure that timing of everything. I mean, there's a lot involved where you actually have a lot of control which was kind of a nice byproduct of all of it. Doesn't really make up for the stress involved, but there are some perks in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, we knew early on if this did work, it would be a girl. And I think knowing the gender, sort of having that to sort of grasp onto was really helpful and meaningful.
Yes.
But
definitely.
so after I had this like really faint line on the stick, I'm like, I think we might be pregnant. Then we went into the clinic and they took a blood test and it was like sort of positive. And they said we need to wait for a certain amount of days to see if the hormones double or triple or whatever it was. So there was this phase where we were sort of like, I think we're pregnant, but I'm not exactly sure. And then we went in a few days later and they were like, I'm not really sure. Come back in a few more days. And so we went a few more days later and they're like, yes, things look like they're going in the right direction, but you need to stay on the shots. And so again, we were still at this place of like, I think we're pregnant, but I'm not really sure. And I feel like that feeling sort of characterized at least the first trimester, if not more, of our pregnancy. That like, is this happening? Is it not? Should we be happy? Should we not? Can I like read a baby book yet? Can I go shopping for little baby booties? No, it was really just this sense of, I think I could be happy, but I really didn't want to get too excited about it.
Right.
Because I was at that phase of my life, like so strongly trying to sort of guard my own emotions.
Oh, totally. We'd gone through so many kind of ups and downs with it. The last thing I wanted was to let myself be excited just to be let down later. And I everyone who gets pregnant has that sense of like, well, I should wait a little bit in case things don't work before I make a public announcement. But I felt like for us, we had to wait even longer and be even more doubly sure that things were working because it felt like there was such a chance this is all going to just like slip away from us so fast.
And I think in reality, that chance was much lower than a lot of women who do this the normal way experience.
Which is also interesting because that's one thing, partly why we chose to go like the frozen genetically tested route was because the odds of a miscarriage are greatly reduced when you do the genetic testing because essentially they choose very healthy embryos, which means the odds of miscarriage are reduced. And so the odds of you being pregnant and staying pregnant and having a healthy delivery, all of that is just better odds. And yet we still felt this sense of like, this may not work.
Right. And I also felt this feeling of why can't this just be like normal people have? But now I realize probably most people have that fear of, is this really happening? Is this not?
Yeah.
So I think throughout the whole IVF process, I really just wanted things to be normal. But now I see a lot of the stuff we went through really probably is normal and is experienced by most women or most families.
Oh, right. Certainly. I mean, I think that the roller coaster ride of emotions is that's life as a parent. I mean, really, that's what you go through. And so we just were getting a stronger dose of that before she actually existed. So that was really interesting. So at that point, then we went in for the blood tests and basically had confirmation that, yes, it's working. We went in for a 10-week heartbeat test at one point, 10 weeks in, and that didn't go well, which is also kind of freaky.
And by that point, that was at the midwife clinic.
Yeah, so we basically had made the transition from fertility treatments into you're now seeing people who are there to help you be a pregnant lady. And the first appointment didn't go very well because I couldn't find a heartbeat. Which,
again, is that feeling of, is this happening? Is this not really happening? I mean, we had done a vaginal ultrasound at the fertility clinic. So we've seen the heartbeat a couple times, I think. Or heard it or something.
Right.
So we were like, yes, this is happening. Even, at that point, the blood test had come back and said like, yes, the pregnancy hormone is going up. We saw the heartbeat. They show you the ultrasound and I can't tell
it's
what
just
it
a fuzzy
is. And they're
mess.
like, look this. And I'm like, it doesn't look like anything to me.
Right.
So we had sort of been excited and then we went in for the heartbeat with the midwives who were doing an ultrasound like outside, like a belly ultrasound. And they weren't even doing an ultrasound. They had a Doppler. So we were just hoping to hear the heartbeat and they couldn't find it at the time. And they, of course, were like, oh, it's 10 weeks. It's pretty early. Come back in a couple weeks and we'll try again. And so I think they probably were fairly positive, but on our end, it was just really scary to think that like all this hasn't worked. And the baby that we saw and heard earlier isn't there. So again, back to that, like, I'm not sure this is happening. I thought it was, and now it's not. So the roller coaster just continued.
It did. And speaking of continuing, part 2 of this conversation is going to take place later on. Today was all about the kind of fertility treatments, the joy of getting pregnant leading up to what this moment is now. But we're going to have a part 2 about this because there's a lot more of this story to tell. And I'm really excited about part 2 because part 2 has some thrill rides in it, some really fun stuff. So if you enjoyed the conversation today, if you liked hearing about this, please send me an email, jeff@jeffsanders.com. And I ask that because this is a conversation that I wanted to have for a long time. And I mean, just to be frank, I've been asked about parenting advice for years, but without having a kid of my own, the last thing I want to do is to give that. So I feel like in many ways, the 5 a.m. Miracle has taken a major upgrade, and we're in a new territory now. And so I'm excited to dig into what that may bring in the next coming years. And so part 2 of this, we're going to discuss, once again, all of pregnancy, delivery, life as new parents, all of that fun stuff. And it's going to be a blast. So Tessa, thank you very much for being here today.
Yes, thanks for having me. And I think, if there are people out there who are thinking about fertility treatments or who are sort of going through infertility, I hope that that there are a lot of women and families doing that. And you're not alone. And I encourage you to find someone to talk to, someone to be there for you. If you haven't already, you don't have to do it alone. And if that needs to be me, email Jeff and he'll pass it on to me. But I just think this, in society, people think that they have to go through this alone. And I really hope that we can make conversations about fertility and infertility treatments and labor and delivery and all of that a little bit more common household conversations, because it's not, it doesn't have to be this really isolating thing. Yes, there are ups and downs, but life has ups and downs, and I think it's better to go through those with other people.
Well said. Totally agree. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
And for the action step this week, connect with someone. If you're facing a challenge and you're trying to do it alone, don't. One of the best parts of life is sharing your difficulties and challenges with people you trust, because they can offer you a third-party perspective that you just cannot get without them. Life is definitely better and easier and so much more fun when you involve other people and open up to them. So if it helps, you can send an email to jeff@jeffsanders.com, and then Tessa or I can respond and help wherever we can, especially if you are going through a similar challenge with fertility. Once again, my email is jeff@jeffsanders.com. And as always, be sure to go to the show notes page for the episode this week. That's jeffsanders.com/255, as in episode 255. And that's all we have for you this week. So until next time, remember that you have the power to change your life. And that fun begins bright and early.